I'd like all of us to think about
science and its methods and tools,
space-time,
the nature of human consciousness,
artificial intelligence,
incredibly realistic humanoid robots,
the new technologies for gene editing,
the battle against climate change,
future civilization, Mars, Moon, wherever we're going to go.
A laser highway of laser beams shooting the consciousness of aliens at the speed of light.
What? Dude.
Get smarter faster with new Big Think videos daily from the world's most brilliant minds. I am Peter Hopkins, the president and co-founder of Big Think, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today's topic is reading as therapy, using literature and poetry to cope with loss. I am pleased to introduce today's guest, Professor Lisa New. Lisa has been producing educational materials on American poetry for tens of thousands of global learners of all ages. She's the professor of American literature at Harvard. She is the creator and host of the PBS television series Poetry in America, which just debuted its second season. We'll talk about that later in the webinar. And finally, she is the director of Verse Video Education. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Peter. Delighted to be here.
It's so great to have you. First, a couple housekeeping notes. If you are new to Big Think Live, today's webinar will last about 45 minutes. We'll start with a discussion with Lisa first, followed by audience Q&A. Today, we also will be looking at two poems in particular that are featured in the new season of Poetry in America, one by Elizabeth Bishop, one by Mark Dotys. There should be links where you're viewing, be it Facebook, YouTube, or on Big Think. We encourage you to open that up because we're going to be looking at different aspects of the poems throughout the conversation as we reflect on the role of poetry as therapy and poetry as consolation. And if you have questions, please enter them wherever you're watching, be it in the comment section on Facebook or YouTube, or on our own site or Big Think Edge. And with that, let's dive in. Lisa, to start things off, how do you think about literature and poetry as coping devices?
Well, many of us learned as children, and I am one of those who learned that curling up with a book or a poem was a way of allowing my imagination to travel away from my own mundane concerns. And so obviously one of the ways in which we use poetry, art of all kinds, is to deliver us into the refreshment of another state of mind. And even art and even poetry that speaks to our own immediate emotional trials and excruciations, even that art is in some ways transporting. I as a young person did fall in love with poetry, in particular because I discovered that a line of poetry often had the tone of my own most mysterious feelings. It would have the tone or provide in its imagery a complex blend, a synthesis of things I thought and felt and saw, and that weren't expressed in any other way. And so the recourse to poetry is, for me, and I think for so many new and old readers of the art form who love it, is a way of getting in touch with ourselves, of understanding ourselves better, that paradoxically also takes us out of ourselves.
Let's expand on that a little bit. In the conversation we were having just before broadcast, I was saying that in particular, in reading the Mark Dodie poem, which is set in Chelsea, Manhattan, where I am currently locked away in my one-bedroom apartment, really evoked a lot of emotions for me that I've been feeling during this time walking these very same streets. And said, I commented that I don't think my therapist could elicit from me some of the emotions that poem did, and you were very matter of fact in suggesting why. Why probe a little deeper, and why are these words able to elicit from us sentiments that we can't even in a sort of self-reflective way necessarily come to on our own?
Well, one of the useful kinds of help that a poem or a work of art provides is that it does some of the work for us. You show up in your therapist's office, for instance, and you've got to figure out on the spot your own complexity. A good poem, and I think of a line of a teeny weeny little 2-word line in Mark Dodie's poem, like nothing right. Just a minute or so into the poem, we hear nothing right. And that nothing right refers to how just the annoyance of the poet that he can't find a place to get a good haircut. That, he went to Dublin, he went, he went to 2 places, he just can't get a good haircut. And yet that nothing right reverberates with a deeper kind of discontent that in the context of the poem allows us to see how your annoyance at not being able to get a haircut and your deepest feelings of loss and being out of place in the world are in some ways the same. And I don't know, I can't produce that kind of insight myself when I'm talking to a friend or my husband about what's wrong in my day. And so I think what poems do, and of course poems come to us from other human beings who feel and experience many of the things that we do, what they do for us is offer a friendly kind of coaching and a kind of acceleration of understanding, and an acceleration of understanding that's often providing accelerant to our feelings as well.
Well, let's segue to one of the poems we've selected to discuss today, and that's Elizabeth Bishop's One Art. I'm going to give my colleagues a few moments to tee up a video from Poetry in America's second season, your PBS series. But while they do that, maybe you could give the audience some sense of the context of who Elizabeth Bishop was, and also how this poem sort of fit into her larger body of work.
This poem is by many considered Elizabeth Bishop's great masterpiece. It's written in a technically very difficult form, the villanelle, that has a very strict form. It has 19 lines. I won't go into all of the details, but one of the reasons it's a masterpiece is that it's a combination of highly individual feeling and classic form that reminds us what poetic form is for. But to go back to the immediate circumstances that probably propelled Elizabeth Bishop to write it, she had so many losses. The poem is called One Art, and it begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master." And this poet had so many opportunities to engage with loss. The first of them, the loss of her mother to mental illness. Her mother was taken to an asylum when she was 5 years old, and that occurring a few years after she'd lost her father. She lost her lover, Lota de Suarez, the great love of her life, Lota de Suarez, to suicide. She suffered various physical, she had asthma, she had eczema, she was alcoholic as a way of, she medicated, self-medicated using alcohol. And, she does sound like rather a sad sack. At the same time, her extraordinary emotional sensitivity and her eye for the details of the physical world made her one of the most admired and beloved poets of the middle of the 20th century. And she remains to this day the poet. If you ask, I've never done the statistics here, but if you ask poets who is the great poet of the 20th century whom you most admire and emulate, and many will say Elizabeth Bishop.
Well, it is striking the sense of wisdom and having the life that she had lived really radiates from the poem. We've got the video ready, so we're going to play a clip from the episode that covers this poem in the second season of Poetry in America. Lisa, anything you want to add before we hit the play button?
I guess I would just say that the guests I was able to assemble for this episode, including Katie Couric, Sheryl Sandberg, Mary Chapin Carpenter, poet Greg Orr, journalist Yan Lan from China, and a great psychiatrist. They were a dream team of interlocutors on the topic of sorrow.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a look at this clip of One Art.
Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master.
Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster.
I lost my mother's watch. And look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master.
Lovely. Now, Lisa, you are going to actually read the whole poem for us, which I think would be great for the audience to hear.
Would you like me to do that now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I will. One Art. The art of losing, I'm reading it, I'm looking sideways because I'm reading it right on my screen. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, how did this, obviously this was a poem you covered in Poetry in America. It's also one that you immediately thought of in the context of this discussion, which was poetry in literature in crisis. What is it? Give us your thought process. Why did this occur to you? What do you think it represents as far as the current moment and loss in general?
Let me, I will answer that almost immediately, but I should say first that the credit for my including this poem in the second season of Poetry in America goes to Katie Couric, whom when I invited her to read a poem with me, she said, fine, okay, but this is the poem I'm reading. and that
Oh.
sometimes happens. This was a poem.
And it's important to remind everyone that, Katie Couric suffered tremendous loss of her first husband, from colon cancer, if I'm not mistaken.
And her sister, and then her sister to cancer as well.
Oh.
And after Katie and I had filmed on this poem together a few years ago, she was lying on the bed of another loved one who was ill, and she wrote to me out of the blue to say this poem was on her mind. And so for Katie, this poem was the sort of talismanic expression of much of what she had gone through as she's navigated the losses of her life. When you asked me, Peter, to participate in a Big Think webinar, it was the poem I immediately thought of for this awful, strange, disorienting time we live in, because the poem gets at that mixture of the immense and the trivial that is part of how human beings have to get through times that are often very terrible. The mix of tone in the poem, which allows all of the terrible, engulfing feelings of loss to recur. One feels that in the rhythm of the poem. But the poem is also, it's probably wrong to say funny, but it's witty. It's witty in a self-punishing sort of way. And the resources of wit and of sarcasm and of irony do appear for us, do come to hand. And we, our tones, as we all go through this COVID virus, our tones inevitably move in the course, every day in the course of our day, from, the shock and the sorrow and the feeling of bereftness into humor, into a kind of survivalist, sometimes Black humor, and this poem has that. To just the first line, the art of losing isn't hard to master, is so sarcastic. Right? And another element that Sheryl Sandberg, when we talked about the poem together, that Sheryl really brought to the fore for me, is the way small things, small losses, may sit at the other end of a spectrum from large losses. We like to think that, you lose your keys, no big deal. You lose a husband, a loved one, big deal. That those are completely different things. But of course, in our day-to-day lives, the small losses are often, we suffer them more deeply, right? Or or they happen to us more. Right? You have the feeling that the speaker of this poem is not just a person who's been afflicted with a lot of sorrow, but that she's kind of a mess, right? She's kind of messing up. That there's a self-fulfilling prophecy and a kind of syndrome of losing that is afflicting her on all levels. And, as we're going through our days, the small things are bugging us too. Right? Everybody's crazy obsession with toilet paper somehow seems to me, well, actually, toilet paper, that would be a huge loss. We understand that, right? We're all thinking, I can't lose my toilet paper. I'm sorry I brought this conversation to a strange.
No, this is precisely what we want. We want to connect this to the moment, and because there are so many aspects of being in this sort of quarantine and uncertainty that make, at least in my own experience, have catalyzed frustrations that seemingly are disproportionate with what has happened, because I'm not able to deal with the broader it's unresolved. Why am I stuck in my house? When am I going to get let out? What will be there when I do?
Right, and the poem, this poem of Elizabeth Bishop's, one stanza will begin, "I lost my mother's watch," and then the line goes on, "And look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went," and you can see the poet struggling there, the speaker of the poem struggling there with exactly what you say, proportion. How do I? My last house, my next to last loved house. She'll then go on, "I lost 2 cities, lovely ones." Is that understatement or overstatement? So that in these times when we think, oh, we should have perspective, it is the human condition really not to have perspective, and this poem shows us that. It also shows us our tendency to compulsive, ritualistic, repetitive coping strategies, which is one of the ways in which Bishop's use of the tightly controlled form of the villanelle elevates this poem. It's a very repetitive form, and it has a kind of robotic quality almost, and it's an appropriate form for the to illustrate loss, which finds dysfunctional coping strategies for itself. I'm sorry, I think we might be gone. Hi.
No, hello. You see me?
Hello.
We're here.
I lost you all.
Yes, no worries. 2 production notes for our audience. One is people have asked about the audio issues. Lisa is joining us from a windswept Cape Cod, and I am apparently joining from a internet-starved Chelsea, Manhattan. My video keeps freezing apparently.
It does.
So apologies for that. If I disappear, I will be immediately back.
Good. The wind is pounding against my windows here, and there are little breakers out on the bay. It's quite beautiful, but it's bad for audio.
Right. The only downside, it would seem, to quarantining in Cape Cod. Otherwise, that's where I would want to be.
Yes.
A question that came to me, Lisa, as you were talking, is, and this is one I want you to address really from your role as a professor. What do you think, beyond the words of a poet, what does understanding their life bring to the meaning of their work? In this case, I'm thinking of all the loss of Elizabeth Bishop, which, in my brief reading of her Wikipedia page, became almost apparent immediately, and then really does color this poem in a different way. It really does. So this is a woman who knew what it meant to lose things she loved.
Yes. And, scholars of poetry are very divided on how much attention we should pay to the life circumstances of a poet. And I'm not dogmatic about that. I think it's clear with a poet like Elizabeth Bishop and a poem like One Art that one really understands the poet, the figure of the poet, not as some eccentric character, but as a human being who writes poetry out of human need, and that to deprive ourselves of thinking about the life circumstances of this poet would be to not be afforded a dimension of the poem that we need. I mean, there are poems and there are poets whose life circumstances, becloud our reading of their poems, especially if we try to turn everything we see in the poem into a sort of mini biography of what happened to the poet. But with the poems we're talking about today, we are reading the work of human beings who are sharing with us the struggles they have, and allowing us to hear in our own voices, and our own thoughts, what they experience, to make contact with them as people. And so these are the right kind of poems written by people who want you to understand that they are people. Not all poems, not all poems come to us with that invitation or that claim.
We chatted a bit about this in our conversation prior, but speak about the strategies of curation that people might embrace to find the right author in the right moment. How do you navigate, and how do you think about embracing the right literature at the right time?
Yeah, and it's bewildering. It's sort of like choosing a TV show. I get so stressed out doing that. I sometimes decide to read a book where I'm more familiar. So one thing I recommend to lots of readers is actually to go to the website of my friends at the Poetry Foundation, and to, if you're in a particular place, type in that place and see if there's a poem that is about your neighborhood. Sometimes there is. If you are in a particular state of mind, if it's an anniversary or a birthday, or you've lost a loved one, you can use, and I think you were asking me a deeper question, Peter, but I think really, if one is at a loss for what to read, it's really great to have a resource and the Poetry Foundation is an app, it's on your phone. You just go to it and say, virus. If you look up virus, I bet there are a bunch of virus poems. So that's one strategy. Another is to find one poem you like, and to follow, and to try another by the same poet. Perhaps using some of the same strategy. I think about this question in a slightly different way as I curate the episodes in the Poetry in America television series. I am looking within a season for there to be an episode for many states of mind and for many occasions. I'm looking for great diversity and range, and so I want viewers to know, and I want this as a teacher as well, I want viewers to know that if you want to look at the beauty of the natural world, and to think about the fragility of that beauty, perhaps, well, there's a poem for you, and it's called and it's called Marion Moore's The Fish. And if you're stuck at home and feel lost and looking at your shaggy head that hasn't been barbered, well, there's a poem for you. And I am trying in the series to address uninitiated viewers and readers who may not understand, who may think poetry is just, I don't know, sentiment or what you write to your girlfriend to, because you love her or something. And that poetry is an art form that touches all of the domains of our lives. They're poems written that help you understand your workplace, getting fired. There's an incredible poem by a wonderful poet named Mark Halliday about losing your job and about thinking about the halls in which you once walked that you thought were yours. And there's a poem for everything. And so it's that I try to suggest to readers and to viewers. And in the 20 poems that comprise the first 2 seasons of Poetry in America, the television series, I'm trying to suggest that there is a poem waiting there for you. And I'm trying to choose some of the best ones for you.
Will you also do that in the series quite powerfully through the diversity of voices that you've recruited? to talk to not only poets but just a wide array of luminaries from so many different fields. Sort of speak to them, that motivation, and sort of what we were hoping to achieve by recruiting some of these disparate celebrities and influencers to talk about poetry in their own lives.
It's interesting the way someone as large in every sense as Shaquille O'Neal could be a proxy for the uninitiated reader, even as Shaquille O'Neal will tell you if he's reading a poem in my series, as he does, he will tell you, oh, it's cool to read poetry. If you like sports, you might also like poetry. And that's a valuable benefit I've seen from having people like Shaquille O'Neal read poems with me. But he's also showing you, I'm not that familiar with this art form. I didn't come to be on this show because I'm an expert, and I'm sort of digging it. And so those are the two of the effects that I think we've been able to observe from these readers. I'm thinking in this season about John Kerry. John Kerry comes on to read a poem about Vietnam with us, a poem by Yusuf Kumanyaka. And John Kerry says things in reflecting on this poem that are different from anything he's ever said in public that I've been able to find about Vietnam. One of the most moving things he talks about is the smell, how you would be on the base and you could smell the cook fires of people in the villages around you making breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so that's yet a different kind of expertise that a person like John Kerry will bring to the series. Not just his celebrity, not just his example of, hey, you can read poetry too, but he had some life experience that overlaps with the experience that did propel the poet to write the poem, and he shows us how that experience is reanimated, how his own imagination and his own memory has been reanimated by reading this poem. And of course he shares a very tender part of himself that I feel so privileged that he was willing to share. One of the things I do so love and feel so honored that happens in the series is the way people whom we think we know really do show curiosity and wonder. They're unscripted. They're not. They're kind of. They've strayed beyond where their teams who produce their talking points can help them sometimes, and they bring a genuine human. A genuine human responsiveness, which is of course also what poetry can do, and conversation about poetry can do.
We are going to move on to our next question, which is from an audience member. Hold on one second.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm excited to hear this question.
I got the cue that I froze, but I returned.
Yeah, you're freezing a little bit, and the wind is blowing. It's kind of
bad day for internet.
Turbulent. Very beautiful and dramatic.
But we're going to move on to the second poem in a moment, but I wanted to ask one audience question that came up about Elizabeth Bishop.
Sure.
The question really was, in your opinion, does the poem imply any solutions to managing disaster? Can we draw that from the words, or is she merely compelling us to think about the question?
Does life have solutions exactly? Understanding is the beginning of a solution. I think, but I will try to answer this question directly. If we go to the very last stanza of the poem, the stanza Katie Couric and in fact the phrase Katie Couric thought was most important, here it is. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like write it, like disaster. That write it does say that expression, whether in writing or in, I think that write it in some ways applies to any form of expression. That expression, that finding form for our suffering and sharing that expression, that formed expression with others, does constitute a kind of solution. I mean, there is no solution to loss of one's mother, to the grief you feel at the suicide of a loved one. There is no solution. There is understanding and consolation, and perhaps the externalization that comes from write it may provide that. That's my best.
No, that's great.
The best I got.
We are going to segue now to the second poem. Lisa, if you could give us a little preview. Who is Mark Dodie? And the poem is This Your Home Now? Kind of place it in context of his life and work.
Okay. So Mark Dodie is an extraordinary poet who probably first came to public prominence during in the books that he was very admired by poets, but at that point in the 90s when the AIDS epidemic began to claim tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of victims, Mark Dodie wrote one of the great books of the AIDS epidemic. He lost his own partner. He was in fact living just, I can see Provincetown, Massachusetts from where I'm sitting here on Cape Cod. He brought his partner there, and he writes this poem, This Your Home Now, reflecting back on the losses that he suffered and struggling really with guilt, his own feelings of aging, and his uncertainty about what forms of consolation the living, those who survive, can legitimately claim for themselves. And the form of consolation that is front and center in the poem is the consolation of getting a haircut, of sitting in a chair and having someone take care of you, make you look better, someone make you look more attractive to yourself, someone touch you. And the poem, which does not specify in its early tercets, in its early three-line stanzas, that it's going to be about the AIDS epidemic. The poem takes us to a barber's chair where the poet he's trying to find the right barber, where it will feel good and where he will be able to sort of live with himself. And I won't say everything that goes on in the poem, because it has a sort of fantastical dimension that I'm hoping some will see in the episode itself. But Dodie's poem is so pertinent to what we are all experiencing now, at a moment when one of the things we've lost is the comfort of the city streets, of just doing common things like going to the barber. Everybody's hair is a mess. right? Common things, going to the barber, going for a cup of coffee, going to get a newspaper, enjoying the changing weather. We've lost that, and we've lost the simple freedom of letting someone touch us, right? Letting a stranger touch us. And this poem does wrestle with the great satisfaction and pleasure, the simple touch of someone cutting your hair can give you, even as it looks back to that moment in the 90s when a gay man like Mark Dodie and the other guests in the episode couldn't sit in a barber's chair without feeling terror, right? Without feeling terror that they'd be cut, that they would, that a barber would be afraid of them. And so all of those struggles we are going through now as we both try to extend our loving kindness to those around us, and we literally fear that they will get too near us. That is a central subject of this poem. The guilt we feel at the guilt I feel at enjoying the sunshine on this beautiful day in Cape Cod. Am I allowed to enjoy this? Can I be? There's a line in the poem where Dottie says, "Can I be a little satisfied?" Am I allowed?
Let's take a look. We have a wonderful clip from the series where Mark Dottie himself actually reads an excerpt. So let's play that now and have a listen.
Willie, I have not lived well in my grief for them. I have lugged this weight from place to place as though it were mine to account for. And today I sit in your good chair in the 6th decade of my life. And if your back door is a threshold of the kingdom of the lost, yours is a steady hand on my shoulder. Go down into the still waters of this chair and come up refreshed, ready to face the avenue. Maybe I do believe we will not be left comfortless. After everything comes tumbling down, or you tear it down and stumble in the Shadow Valley trenches of the moon, there's still a decent chance at a barbershop, salsa on the radio, the instruments of renewal wielded effortlessly, and who'd have thought, for you.
Those lines, which sound so simple, have embedded in them, as many of your listeners will notice, have embedded within them allusions to the 23rd Psalm. You know, stumble through the Shadow Valley trenches of the moon, the instruments of renewal, that those are the waters, those are the still waters beside which one walks in the 23rd Psalm. And the way a poem like this poem that reads so casually, just reads like, wow, I'm a poor soul walking around, getting older, still haunted by my past, still wondering whether I deserve the small comforts. The way that ordinary kind of neurotic human obsessing can be elevated by language from the Bible, and the ordinary frets or extraordinary frets of human beings connected to that old language of suffering and of consolation. That's the kind of thing poems do that can't get other places. Your therapist doesn't say Shadow Valley trenches of the moon for you.
Well, the thing that I mentioned this to you earlier, this poem is set in the neighborhood I live in New York City, and the sense of one's relationship to change that you can't control is really very powerful to me, and the feeling I have, in those, now rare opportunities to get out and walk around this neighborhood that he writes about, and the worry I have about, will this place be the same as it was before, and the sort of inexorable conclusion that it will not be. He just captures it. Yeah.
It will be, and I think that's what the poem tells us, that the barbershop will always be, for this poet, a place that's fraught, and your neighborhood, as you walk around it, will flicker. Even as normal rhythms resume, will flicker or vibrate with a whole other set of memories and resonances, and that doubleness that we all experience in places that have changed, as your New York City is changed, and my Cape Cod, where I'm sitting now, is changing. Poems get that.
Yeah. And yet he has in the same way that Bishop has a sort of stoic silver lining, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
There's something to this notion that he writes about the new barbershop, which has so many of the elements of the old barbershop, that he almost suggests and invites us to sort of say, even though things are going to change for you, you can find constancy in the new, and not everything has changed that you might have thought.
Or that you can use your mind, right? That we use our minds to find that constancy. I mean, this too is, we make connections, we find analogies, that our imaginations become places that help us feel at home, right? Your home now. Yes, he did go to a new barbershop where there's this awesome salsa on the radio. We had so much fun doing the salsa in this episode, but also this barbershop is being integrated into the life experience of this speaker, and that is what we all do. Indeed, the question that came from someone in your audience, is this a solution? I think that Dottie, more than Bishop, is telling us that a haircut is a miracle, right? Being able to get a haircut and go and have coffee, and go while you're getting coffee and starting to write a poem. That everydayness is worth living for and worth being very grateful for. So I think Dotie's is a poem of deep, deep gratitude, but not one that has, and for me, the authenticity of the poem is that its gratitude lives with its still unsettled sense of guilt. Guilt, of sorrow, of unprocessed stuff that he's never going to process. He says, I have not lived well with my grief. I've dragged it around. It's done its damage, and yet I can go have some coffee.
Yeah. I mean, so much like the feelings so many of us are having right now, where, whatever side of this crisis you're on, invariably there is a sense of guilt that has to be managed, dread that has to be contained, and and solace found in the simple acts of having a cup of coffee.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I love so much about this poem, and I'm so glad that to be talking with you about it, and so glad people who watch the series and read Dottie will see, is that I feel that this poem gives us tools to have the compassion, right, as well for ourselves as well as for others, that we might not have had we might not have known how to extend before. I think we're all learning that now. We're learning about our own fear. We're coming to understand other people's fear. Every time I pass somebody in the grocery store and we both take a step back, right? To make sure that we're not, I feel guilty, right? I feel I'm trying to signal, I don't mean to hurt you. I have to protect myself. I care about you, and that empathy is something that we're all getting practice at developing every day. And we have to be empathetic to ourselves too, because sometimes we say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that jerk was not wearing a mask."
Right.
And
what better place to turn than to poetry? I mean, I think people are looking for find the challenge of how do you practice, how do you metabolize these new sentiments? And the reality is, you're not going to be able to do it with your friends because they're, or in the same way. You might as well turn to past repositories of this wisdom. Now, Lisa, we come up on the hour. We've got a bunch of audience questions. We're going to try to squeeze in just a few of them because we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So one question from the audience is actually specifically about your relationship with poetry. Is there a poem in your own life that you can identify as sort of sparking your love and interest in poetry? Is there something that really got you hooked?
Well, what got me hooked literally was a golden book, a beautiful golden book of the poems of Robert Louis Stevenson that I was given as a 4 or 5-year-old. And I many years later, I saw it in an antique bookstore, and I know it has these gorgeous illustrations, but the poem that really hooked me was, "Oh, how I love to go up in a swing, up in the air, up in the sky so blue. Oh, I do think it the pleasantest thing ever a child can do." And the correlation between the sort of brimming joy of that, of those lines, and my own delight in swinging, and I mean, that poem taught me that you feel poems with your body, that a poem that's really good at what it does somehow mimic, or it's just words on a page. How does it do that? It's just print. How does it do that? That it makes you feel, wow, I'm swinging. And, for years after, whenever I'm on a swing, and then as I was raising my 3 children, we would recite that poem together as I was pushing them. And so I think you might have wanted something more profound, but that's it.
No, that's beautiful. That's fantastic. We have a couple of questions that sort of circle around the idea of the barriers to entry for those who into poetry and fine literature, for those who are unacquainted. Sort of, one person says, I just don't relate to poetry. How am I able to overcome that? Another person writes, with so few people reading for pleasure, i.e. curling up with a book, is the idea of even embracing poetry becoming elitist? And how do we make it more accessible and less of a sort of more of a universal activity and indulgence? Any thoughts on that sort of general idea of how do we build that bridge and where to start?
Well, it is, when one comes to love it, it's really similar to the experience you have singing a Beatles song, or looking at a photographer you really love. You understand, eventually you understand the medium. But so I have a few suggestions. One is, and I don't mean this as a plug, but I do think that the TV series is a good way to observe people coming over a half an hour that in some way should suggest multiple readings, that coming into like deep love of an individual poem. Wow, this poem really speaks to my experience. And I think of the first episode in the series, which is a poem about Chinese immigrants to San Francisco. And it's actually about the history of San Francisco. The poem is not easy, but as one reads it and as we watch a set of people reading it together, a very full-bodied and comprehensive set of reflections on why you love San Francisco and what it means that San Francisco was settled early on by Asian immigrants, San Francisco as a Pacific Rim city. Anyway, so there's an awful lot to learn, but having said, and poems, thinking of a poem not as, not in the same way you think of narrative art forms, where they're linear and you go kind of skating through, bobbing along. Instead, thinking about them in the way you feel about songs you love. You want to hear them again. You want to, if their lyrics are great, I think, Bob Dylan, buckets of rain, buckets of tears, got all those buckets coming out of my ears. Those lines will never, ever get old for me. And, for a variety of reasons. So I think thinking about poetry as a, I don't even know if we're supposed to wash our hair twice anymore, or if that was what shampoo companies wanted us to do. But it's like a rinse repeat art, and it gets better as you go. Also, though, Mark Dotey, not Mark Dotey, Billy Collins. Billy Collins writes a really great poem about how we think that poems are these things we have to torture the meaning out of, which is torturous for us as well. Like, who wants to be the inquisitor torturing the meaning out of a poem? And he says, he wants a poem to be more like, what you greet as you're water skiing out on you're water skiing and you go, hey. So I think taking a slightly more casual attitude toward poetic art can help. But I think I have to offer a shameless plug. I have thought about this a lot, and I think giving a half an hour to a good poem with a bunch of other readers, not just me, might help the uninitiated.
And just as a sort of logistical note, how can people find poetry in America? What's your guidance for finding it in their local area or online?
It's so we premiere in cities across the country, in times across the dial. We are on the World Channel on Saturday evenings at 7:30 Eastern Time, and going across the country down to 4:30 Pacific Time. We stream on our website, on Amazon Prime, on iTunes, and on PBS Passport. And we hope that the second season of Poetry in America, like the first season, will this fall begin airing on Plains. That was exciting for me when I learned that I had made a series that people were watching on airplanes. Of course, they are captive.
Yes, a captive audience. Well, who doesn't love a captive audience?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
With that, we have run to the hour. This has been such a wonderful hour to spend with you. I have learned a lot. I know the audience really enjoyed it. So thank you so much,
Peter. Thank you. I loved it. A big think.
Well, Big Think loves you, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Just a programming note, if you enjoyed this webinar, please join us next Monday at 4 p.m. when I will be moderating a conversation with best-selling author and co-founder of the Flow Research Collective, Stephen Kotler. He is a really forward thinker and has really interesting ideas on how you can achieve flow state even when you are locked in your studio apartment. So if you are around on Monday at 4, please join us for that. And Lisa, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.